Tonight, an I-team investigation of local teachers arrested and charged with having sex with Duval, St. John's, Clay, and Baker County students.
The latest arrest came just this afternoon. This Fletcher High School teacher, 26-year-old Zachary Shabhut, is charged with unlawful sexual activity. According to the charge, the victim is 16 or 17 years old. The arrest report says the incident was in October of last year and occurred at the school, but was just reported to police last week. The school district says the teacher has been removed from the classroom pending the outcome of the investigation.
This arrest comes as the I-team has been digging into a startling local trend of similar cases. A closer look at some of the arrests and jail sentences reveals most teachers who were caught do little jail time for these highly publicized crimes.
Also tonight, the mother of a Jacksonville victim is calling for harsher punishments for convicted teachers, and State Attorney Angela Corey is responding to questions brought to her by the I-team. Tarik joins us now with what he's uncovered. Tarik.
Well, we examined cases for more than 3 years, between January of 2012 to July of 2015. And during that time frame, 10 male and female teachers were all accused of having sex with their students. But only 2 received a lengthy jail sentence, prompting the question, are local teachers accused of having sex with students catching a break through plea deal negotiations? Class was in session, but according to police, these teachers had sex on their minds instead. Police accused all 10 of having sexual relationships with their students, but only 2 served serious jail time. In 2012, Duval County elementary school teacher Christopher Baca received a 40-year sentence for having sex with young male students. Michael Worrell, who worked at 3 Duval County schools over his 9-year teaching career, was sentenced to life behind bars for molesting 2 young girls between the ages of 9 and 13. In 2 other cases, the victims wouldn't cooperate with investigators. As a result, 2 Westside High School teachers walked free. As for the remaining 6, they all took plea deals and ended up facing lesser charges like child abuse or battery. One of those men was Paxton Middle School teacher Leonard Hoffman, who was convicted of having sex with this woman's daughter.
I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It's an awful situation. Nobody should have to go through that, and we should be able to trust the people who we give our children to 8 hours a day.
This mother, who we'll call Tiffany, says her 16-year-old daughter had an ongoing relationship with Hoffman. She says Hoffman homed in on her daughter's weaknesses and convinced her that the feelings they had for each other were okay. She says her daughter's grades started dropping. Her personality changed. It would take her daughter months to admit the 2 were involved intimately.
My daughter took off. She ran away. She ran away to go hang out with him during the day. I believe it was a school day.
Police charged Hoffman with 2 counts of having sex with a minor, a charge that could have landed the teacher in prison for 15 years. But like so many other teacher sex cases, according to lawyers, Tiffany's daughter wasn't strong enough emotionally to testify in court. Hoffman pleaded guilty to adult sex with a 16-year-old and was sentenced to only 1 year in prison.
It was frustrating as a parent to sit there, talk with the DA, and agree to less of a punishment. My hope was, 15 years, absolutely. But again, I wouldn't put my daughter through that.
Do you think because it was such, because it's a teacher, it's so public, that the victims are more likely to not want to testify?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the moment he was arrested, my daughter was scared that she would be labeled in school. She was. She did not continue at that school.
A lot of times the victim is still infatuated with their teacher, and so they don't want to betray them, and they blame themselves.
Former sex crimes prosecutor Rick Alexander says without the victim's testimony, lawyers have a tough time building their case, especially when it comes to proving how many times the sexual act occurred. Alexander says teenage victims typically want to avoid the public spectacle of going to trial to testify. He adds when it comes to women who have sex with their male students, there's a double standard.
I think that teachers in general get a break, but certainly women teachers who had sex with young men, that prejudice is really just coming off the top.
Locally, Atlantic Coast High School teacher Daniel Reed and St. Johns County High School teacher Stacy Slomka both accepted plea deals and never served prison time for having sex with teenage boys. Clay County Elementary School teacher Kimberly Brody served only 1 year in jail for having sex with a 16-year-old in 2013. Alexander says prejudices exist among judges, the jury, and even the young male victims themselves.
One of the challenges that boys face, initially, no one thinks they're a victim, including themselves. Based on the prejudices that people have, they're like, wow, you know, I would be so lucky. But the reality is not at all what the fantasy is.
We asked this male convicted sex offender who spent more than 10 years in prison for molesting a child how he feels about some teachers committing a similar crime and receiving a lesser penalty. He was not a teacher.
It pisses me off. Pisses me off a lot because here I am, you know, I got a 13-year sentence. I did 11 years and 15 days in prison. I'm still on probation. 10 years probation. Then when I see some, like you're saying, these teachers, I'm like, what about them?
It should not be happening. It shouldn't be a revolving door for these people.
This mother says she wants lawmakers to consider a minimum mandatory sentence for teachers convicted of having sex with their students. She's also asking students be given the ability to testify on video rather than in person in court. We took her questions to State Attorney Angela Corey.
The psychological or emotional attachment that forms, I think, could cause our lawyers a different set of problems.
Corey says Florida law does allow sex crimes victims to enter videotape testimony, but the victim has to be under the age of 16. Prosecutor Alan Mizrahi adds that under the law, if a teenager is old enough to drive, they're old enough to consent to sex.
So a 12-year-old up to the age of 16, so 15 and under, is not able to consent to any type of sex. A 16-year-old is able to consent to sexual contact except with those over the age of 23, so 24 and above. And she cannot consent to that. It's a peculiar law, but I think it's well-founded.
As for this mother's idea of a minimum mandatory for teachers convicted of having sex with their students.
Is that even feasible? A minimum mandatory for convicted teachers who have sex with their students?
We have minimum mandatories for a lot of things, so it is it is feasible. But whether or not the legislature can pass that or will pass that remains to be seen.
So this problem of getting student victims to testify in court against their teachers is something that is happening across the country. Florida lawmakers are not currently considering a minimum mandatory sentence for convicted teachers, but that could change if lawmakers follow the state of Oklahoma's lead, where a senator is now pushing for a 10-year mandatory sentence for teachers convicted of having sex with their students.
Tarik, when a student cannot or will not testify in court, is there some way that judges can have a tougher punishment for somebody who's a teacher?
Yeah, the courts can impose a harsher penalty, and they are, according to State Attorney Angela Corey. For instance, in the case that we featured in this story of Leonard Hoffman, while Hoffman only received a year in prison for having sex with a 16-year-old girl, he has been labeled a sex offender for the rest of his life, and he will never, ever teach again.
Thank you, Tarik.